The moment flight attendant Brenda Walsh's hand struck 8-year-old Leo Vance's cheek, the entire first-class cabin of Azure Wings Flight 724 froze. Nobody moved. Not the other flight attendants who shot panicked looks at each other, not the stunned passengers clutching their pre-departure drinks, not even the recycled air seemed to circulate. Leo's father, Elias Vance, America's first black trillionaire, slowly lowered his phone, his usually warm eyes darkening with a quiet, controlled rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his thumb already dialing a number on his speed dial. Brenda smirked, completely unaware that her 20-year career in aviation had just imploded, along with something far greater and more sinister than she could possibly imagine. How could a single, impulsive slap in the rarefied air of first class expose a conspiracy of hate and privilege that would shake America's corporate world to its very foundations? Before we delve into this shocking, true story of discrimination, power, and ultimate justice, let me know where you're tuning in from. If you believe in standing up against injustice and exposing the prejudice that still lurks in the shadows of our society, smash that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening stories that the mainstream media often ignores. Elias Vance adjusted the cuff of his custom-tailored Brioni suit as he guided his children, 8-year-old Leo and 12-year-old Nina, down the expansive jet bridge toward Azure Wings Airline's flagship A380 aircraft for their flight from Chicago to San Francisco. Despite owning a fleet of private jets that could circle the globe, Elias occasionally flew commercial with his family. It was a way, he felt, to stay connected to the everyday experiences that his immense wealth might otherwise shield him from. His latest innovation in quantum computing had just propelled his net worth past the $1 trillion mark, a historic milestone that made him a global headline as America's first black trillionaire. Leo, a bundle of energy, bounced with excitement, clutching a new Cosmic Ranger action figure. Nina walked with a quiet confidence beside her father, already displaying the poise and sharp observational skills that would one day make her a formidable leader in her own right. As they arrived at the aircraft door, lead flight attendant Brenda Walsh's practiced, welcoming smile instantly evaporated. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping over their designer clothes and expensive luggage with unconcealed suspicion. "Coach boarding is from the rear entrance," she stated sharply, not bothering to even glance at the tickets in Elias's hand. Elias calmly held up their 3 first-class boarding passes. "We're in seats 1A through C," he said, his voice even. Brenda snatched the passes from his hand, scrutinizing them as if they were clever forgeries. Finding them legitimate, she reluctantly stepped aside with a tight-lipped, "Very well," then muttered just loud enough for them to hear, "Unbelievable. They'll let anyone fly up here with credit card points these days." As the Vance family made their way to their spacious seats, Elias noted the stark contrast in her behavior. A white family, dressed in expensive but less refined clothing, was greeted effusively, offered pre-flight champagne, and had their bags expertly stowed by the very same attendant who had treated his family with such disdain. "Daddy, why was that lady so mean to us?" Leo whispered, his innocent eyes clouded with confusion. "Some people, son, judge books by their covers no matter how glossy the cover is," Elias answered quietly, helping his children settle into their seats. He had built his empire by recognizing patterns others missed, and he immediately began to mentally document every interaction, every subtle slight. This was far from his first encounter with this brand of casual, insidious racism, even with his astronomical wealth. Money had bought him access to the world's most exclusive spaces, but it couldn't purchase respect from those who refused to see past the color of his skin. As other passengers boarded, Elias reflected on his long journey from the tough streets of Philadelphia's inner city. His single mother had worked 2 full-time jobs to keep him in a decent school where his prodigious mathematical talent had eventually opened the doors to scholarships. Even with degrees from Caltech and Stanford, venture capitalists had repeatedly refused to fund his early startups, their disbelief in his potential barely veiled. It wasn't until a blind submission process, where his ideas were judged solely on their merit, that his genius was finally given a chance. Every single step had required 10 times the effort of his white peers. Brenda and her junior colleague, Kevin Dunn, deliberately avoided the Vance family's section during pre-takeoff service. When she finally approached, she first attended to the white businessmen across the aisle, then the elderly couple seated behind them, before reluctantly turning her attention to the Vances. "Anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked flatly, her tone bored. "Apple juice, please," Leo requested politely, using the impeccable manners his father had so carefully instilled in him. Brenda's eyes rolled almost imperceptibly. She turned to Kevin and said, her voice carrying easily through the cabin, "It never fails. These people always want something extra. Just watch. They'll ask for the whole beverage cart next." Elias maintained his regal dignity, his face an impassive mask despite the indignation burning within him. Nina squeezed her father's hand, her young face tight with the understanding that she was witnessing something ugly and wrong. When Brenda returned, she carelessly thrust the plastic cup toward Leo. The cup tipped, spilling ice-cold water all over Elias's lap and his $6,000 suit. "Oh," Brenda said, her voice devoid of apology. "Your son needs to be more careful when he's grabbing for things." Elias calmly pressed the call button. The senior flight attendant on the crew, Kevin Dunn, arrived, his rank indicated by the additional stripes on his uniform sleeve. "Is there a problem here, sir?" Kevin asked, his eyes darting between Brenda's smug expression and Elias's soaked trousers. "Your colleague here deliberately spilled water on me and then proceeded to blame my 8-year-old son for her carelessness," Elias explained in a low, even tone. Kevin's face hardened. "Sir, I'm quite sure it was an accident. These things can happen during pre-flight preparations." "We're still at the gate. The plane hasn't moved an inch," Nina pointed out, her voice clear and firm. Kevin's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation showing that he disliked being corrected by a child. "I can assure you that none of our highly trained staff would intentionally do such a thing. Perhaps you're just being a little oversensitive." The implication was clear, hanging thick and toxic in the air. Elias immediately recognized the unified front forming against his family. He'd seen it countless times in boardrooms and at country clubs before his success became so immense that it could no longer be ignored or dismissed. He pulled out his phone and began calmly typing detailed notes, including names, times, and exact quotes. This subtle action caused both flight attendants to exchange a nervous glance before they retreated to the galley. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, Elias watched Brenda and Kevin laughing with their colleagues, gesturing dismissively toward his family. He knew from decades of experience that this flight was going to be difficult, but he had no idea just how profoundly it would alter the course of all their lives in the next few hours. As the plane climbed through a patch of choppy air, little Leo Vance whimpered, his small hands pressed against his ears to block the discomfort. Elias knew his son's sensitivity to pressure changes well. This wasn't a display of temper, but genuine pain from eustachian tube dysfunction, a condition their pediatrician had diagnosed. He reached into his carry-on for the specially prescribed eardrops, but before he could administer them, Brenda's sharp voice cut through the cabin noise like a shard of glass. "That child needs to quiet down immediately. she announced loudly, directing her comment to no one in particular, but for everyone to hear. "This is first class, not a daycare center." Elias's gaze drifted across the aisle, where a white family's toddler was crying much more loudly. Brenda was already there, cooing sympathetically, offering the parents a warm towel and a lollipop to help with the child's ear pressure. The contrast could not have been more stark or more publicly demonstrated. Have you ever witnessed a person of authority treating two different people in a wildly different manner based solely on their appearance? What goes through your mind when you see such a blatant double standard? Comment. Equality. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race or background, and if you're finding this story as infuriating as it is important, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories that expose the injustices that need to be brought into the light. Nina, wise beyond her 12 years, unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, addressing Brenda with polite firmness. "Excuse me, ma'am. My brother has a medical condition. He's not trying to be disruptive." Brenda's face twisted into a mask of rage at being challenged by a child, especially a black child, in what she clearly viewed as her sovereign domain. She placed her hand firmly on Nina's shoulder and shoved her roughly back down into her seat. "Your kind needs to learn some respect and stay in your place," she hissed, her voice low enough that only the Vance family could hear. "If you people can't control your children, you shouldn't bring them into spaces meant for adults." Elias felt his heart pound with a fury he kept tightly leashed as he witnessed his daughter being assaulted. He subtly adjusted the position of his phone, angling it to discreetly record the escalating confrontation while he pulled both of his children close to comfort them. Several nearby passengers had noticed the commotion, but most of them studiously avoided eye contact, their complicit silence a phenomenon he'd encountered his entire life. However, one passenger, an elderly white woman seated a row behind them named Eleanor Parsons, a retired school teacher, cleared her throat loudly. "Young lady," Eleanor addressed Brenda, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "your behavior toward those children is utterly appalling. I would like your name and I want to speak to your supervisor at once." Brenda's professional mask slipped away entirely. She turned on Eleanor, her eyes flashing. "Ma'am, since you want to get involved in matters that are none of your business, you will now be the last person in this cabin I serve." The threat was clear and had the intended chilling effect, expanding the circle of her targeted mistreatment. Elias gave Eleanor a nod of profound appreciation. She responded with a knowing look that communicated volumes, a silent acknowledgement between strangers who recognized injustice and the moral imperative to speak out against it. As the seatbelt sign switched off, Leo whispered urgently to his father that he desperately needed to use the lavatory. Elias pressed the call button. Brenda ignored it for nearly 10 minutes before she finally stomped over. "Yes?" she demanded impatiently. "My son needs to use the restroom," Elias explained calmly. Brenda gestured dismissively to the illuminated signs overhead. "The captain has warned of potential turbulence. He'll just have to wait." Not 30 seconds later, a white boy of approximately Leo's age got up from his seat and headed for the bathroom. Brenda smiled warmly at him as he passed. The boy's father hadn't even bothered to ask for permission. What would you do in this situation? Witnessing such a blatant, racially motivated double standard is infuriating. Would you speak up and risk becoming a target like Eleanor, or would you remain silent like most of the other passengers? And what do you think is about to happen that will ultimately lead to an entire flight crew being fired? Stay tuned, because the tension is about to reach a shocking breaking point. Elias Vance stood up. His imposing 6'3" frame instantly commanded attention without him needing to raise his voice. "My son will be using the restroom now, just as that child is," I will also require your full name and your employee ID number. Brenda's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. Are you threatening me, sir? I am documenting a clear pattern of discriminatory and hostile behavior, Elias replied evenly, helping a relieved Leo out of his seat. There is a significant difference. As Leo made his way to the lavatory, Brenda pulled out her own phone. You keep this up, and I will have airport security meet this flight upon arrival. We have a zero-tolerance policy for disruptive passengers, regardless of who they think they are. The threat hung in the air as Elias guided Leo past her. He had built a global empire by knowing precisely when to fight and when to strategize. At this moment, he was doing both simultaneously, methodically gathering evidence while protecting his children. Brenda Walsh had no idea that she wasn't just dealing with any wealthy passenger. She was confronting the man whose strategic genius had revolutionized 3 separate industries and shattered barriers previously thought to be unbreakable. What she also couldn't know was just how catastrophically her next actions would alter the trajectory of everyone on board. 2 hours into the transcontinental flight from Chicago to San Francisco, the first-class cabin filled with the rich aroma of seared filet mignon and truffle risotto as the meal service commenced. Passengers in the forward rows received their meticulously plated lunches on fine china, complete with proper silverware, a signature of Azure Wing's premium service. Brenda moved methodically through the cabin, her service practiced and efficient, until she reached the Vance family's row. We're out of the beef option, she announced flatly. Elias had clearly overheard her confirming to the passenger in the previous row that plenty of both the beef and chicken options remained. The chicken will be fine, Elias replied, his composure unwavering, honed by decades of enduring similar, demeaning treatment. When their meals finally arrived, a full 20 minutes after everyone else had been served, the disparity was blatant. Leo's chicken was visibly cold, the sauce congealed into an unappetizing film on the plate. Nina's vegetarian pasta was missing several key ingredients that the identical meal served to the passenger across the aisle clearly included. Elias's own plate looked as though the food had been deliberately slopped onto it, though he knew that would be impossible to prove. Leo looked down at his unappetizing plate, then at the dessert cart making its way down the aisle, laden with glistening slices of chocolate fudge cake. His disappointment was palpable, but he had been raised by his father to speak up politely when something was wrong. "Excuse me," Leo said in his small, polite voice as Brenda passed by with the dessert cart. "I think I might be missing my dessert." Brenda spun around, her face instantly hardening into a contemptuous sneer. "There is no dessert included with the children's meal." "But that other kid got cake," Leo pointed out, his small finger gesturing toward the other child in the cabin, who was happily devouring a large slice. "Are you calling me a liar?" Brenda's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "Or are you just another one who's trying to get something for free?" Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Excuse me, the boy is right. The menu states that all first-class meal services include dessert." "Stay out of this," Brenda snapped at him before turning her venomous glare back to Leo. "This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior I would expect." Leo, his eyes welling with tears at the public humiliation, reached his hand out tentatively toward his father's untouched slice of cake on the tray table, seeking the small comfort of a shared treat. Like a viper, Brenda's hand shot out and slapped Leo's small fingers with a force that left an angry red welt across his knuckles. "Don't you touch what isn't yours!" she hissed. The cabin fell into a deathly, shocked silence. Several passengers gasped audibly. Leo's eyes overflowed with tears of both pain and humiliation, yet he fought to maintain the composure his father had taught him. Elias remained preternaturally still, his face a granite mask of control, while his mind calculated his next move with the lightning-fast precision that had made him a legend in the business world. "You hurt me," Leo whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. Something inside Brenda snapped at this simple, factual statement. Perhaps it was the calm dignity of a child she had expected to dissolve into a tantrum. Perhaps it was the weight of the increasingly disapproving stares from the other passengers. Whatever the trigger, her self-control shattered. Her hand lashed out again, this time striking Leo across his cheek with an audible crack that echoed through the stunned, silent cabin. "Don't you dare accuse me of anything, you spoiled little brat!" she spat, her face contorted with rage. Time seemed to stop. A woman behind them let out a small scream. Someone's wine glass tumbled to the floor. Leo sat frozen, utterly poleaxed, the red imprint of a grown woman's hand blooming angrily on his small face. Elias Vance had faced down hostile corporate raiders, battled systemic discrimination, and navigated outright hostility his entire life on his meteoric rise from the streets of Philadelphia to becoming America's first black trillionaire. He had always responded with cold, strategic precision rather than hot, reactive emotion. This supreme self-discipline had built his empire and broken countless barriers. But he had never, ever witnessed someone physically assault one of his children. With a deliberate calm that belied the inferno of fury coursing through his veins, Elias pulled out his phone and pressed a single number on his speed dial. Brenda watched him, a smug, contemptuous expression on her face, clearly assuming he was calling some faceless customer service line where his complaint would be logged and promptly disappear into a corporate black hole. "Julian," Elias spoke quietly into the phone, his eyes never leaving Brenda's face. "It's Elias. I'm on Azure Wings Flight 724, Chicago to San Francisco. I need you to contact Chairman Sterling immediately. A flight attendant named Brenda Walsh just physically assaulted my son. Twice. I have the entire incident on video." Brenda's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly regained her confident, belligerent stance. "Sir, you aren't permitted to make phone calls during a flight," she said loudly, for the benefit of the nearby passengers. "And we don't appreciate passengers attempting to name-drop or make baseless threats." Elias simply held her gaze as he continued speaking into the phone. "Yes, I'll hold for the chairman." Then, turning his gaze back to Brenda, he added in a quiet, chilling tone, "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." Brenda rolled her eyes, convinced he was bluffing. She had dealt with entitled, difficult passengers who claimed to know people countless times. She had absolutely no way of knowing that Elias Vance's private equity firm owned a 22% stake in Azure Wings' parent company, or that Chairman Jonathan Sterling had personally flown to his office 2 years prior to beg for his investment during the airline's near-fatal financial crisis. As Brenda strutted away, whispering animatedly with her colleagues and casting disdainful looks back at the Vance family, Elias gently tended to his son's reddened face and hand with a cool cloth. The quiet dignity with which this powerful man comforted his injured child stood in stark, glaring contrast to Brenda's uncontrolled, venomous rage. Several passengers were now openly recording the aftermath on their phones, their earlier reluctance to get involved incinerated by the unconscionable sight of a uniformed adult striking a child. What none of them, not even the belligerent Brenda, could possibly realize yet was that this single, violent moment would trigger a catastrophic cascade of events. It would expose not just one flight attendant's deeply ingrained racism, but an entire corporate conspiracy of hatred and privilege that reached into the highest echelons of America's business elite. The ground was about to shift beneath all their feet. Elias Vance cradled his son Leo close, whispering soft reassurances while pressing a cool, damp napkin against the child's blossoming bruise. Nina, displaying the fierce protective instinct of an older sister, held her brother's other hand tightly and glared daggers toward the galley where Brenda Walsh had retreated with her colleagues. The cabin remained eerily quiet, the air thick with the unprocessed shock of passengers who had just witnessed a uniformed airline employee strike an 8-year-old child in first class. In the galley, Brenda showed no sign of remorse as she huddled with lead flight attendant Kevin Dunn and 2 other crew members. Their hushed conversation was still clearly audible to several passengers seated nearby. "Can you believe the nerve of that guy?" Brenda scoffed, smugly adjusting her uniform. "Acting like he's someone important, threatening to call the chairman. Give me a break." And Kevin Dunn shifted his weight, his eyes darting nervously toward the Vance family. "Brenda, do you know who that is?" "Some rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him and his bratty kids," Brenda replied, dismissively. "That's Elias Vance," Kevin whispered urgently. "The tech billionaire. Actually, I read somewhere he's worth $1 trillion now." A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed Brenda's face, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened, resentful resolve. "So what? A guy like that gets that rich? They always play the race card when they don't get fawning special treatment. I've been flying this route for 20 years. Nothing is going to happen to me." Back in his seat, Elias continued his phone conversation, his voice a paradigm of calm, measured control despite the circumstances. Leo had finally stopped crying, but he remained pressed tightly against his father's side, the child's usual bright-eyed exuberance completely extinguished. Nearby, passengers oscillated between pretending to mind their own business and casting sympathetic, concerned glances toward the family. Exactly 22 minutes after Elias had made his call, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Miller speaking. I have just received instructions from our Central Operations Center in Dallas. We will be diverting to Denver International Airport for an unscheduled landing. This is due to an urgent administrative matter on board. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 40 minutes. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience this may cause." A confused, anxious murmur spread through the cabin. Brenda emerged from the galley, her face flushed, but her stance stubbornly defiant as she marched directly to the Vance family once more. "I hope you're happy," she seethed, leaning down menacingly toward Elias, "inconveniencing over 400 people with your petty complaints." Elias regarded her with a calm, almost pitying look. "The only person responsible for this diversion, Ms. Walsh, is you." "Oh, please," Brenda sneered, her voice loud enough for all the surrounding passengers to hear. "You people always think you're being targeted. Maybe if you'd taught your children some manners instead of crying racism every time someone dares to correct their behavior, none of us would be in this situation." Several passengers audibly gasped at the unmistakable racial dog whistle. Eleanor Parsons, the elderly teacher who had defended them earlier, immediately slammed her call button. Brenda ignored it, her full, venomous attention fixed on Elias. "I know what you're doing," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "Recording everything on your little phone, trying to set yourself up for a big fat settlement. Well, it won't work. I have rights too, and I'm documenting your disruptive and threatening behavior." Elias remained stone-faced, still holding the phone to his ear, though not speaking. Brenda, in her hubris, misinterpreted his silence as submission, or perhaps even fear. "Hand over that phone," she demanded suddenly. "It is against airline policy and federal aviation regulations to record crew members." "No, it isn't," came a firm voice from across the aisle. It was a middle-aged man who identified himself as an aviation attorney. "Passengers are absolutely permitted to record their own experiences on an aircraft, including any and all interactions with the flight crew." Brenda's face contorted with pure rage at this public contradiction. "I wasn't talking to you," she snapped, before turning her glare back to Elias. "The phone. Now." Elias finally lowered his phone an inch. "I'm currently speaking with Chairman Sterling of Azure Wings and Mr. Davies, your CEO. They're both on the line and have been listening to this entire interaction for the last several minutes. Would you perhaps like to have a word with them?" Brenda actually laughed, a harsh, derisive sound. "Right, and I've got the Pope on line too. Your bluffs don't scare me." As if on cue, every single one of the crew phones in the galley began to ring simultaneously with an urgent, shrieking tone. A stunned Kevin Dunn reluctantly answered one, his face draining of all color as he listened to the voice on the other end. He gestured frantically, with Worcester's panicked eyes, for Brenda to join him. "What is it?" she demanded as she approached. It's the chief operating officer," Kevin whispered, his hand shaking as he held the phone out to her. "For you. Specifically." The smug, defiant expression finally shattered on Brenda Walsh's face. It was replaced for a fleeting moment by raw uncertainty before hardening back into defiance. She snatched the phone from Kevin's hand and listened for a few seconds before responding loudly. "That's not what happened at all. They're lying. That child was disruptive and aggressive and I simply—" She stopped, listening again, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the phone. "But you can't just— Don't I even get a chance to— Hello? Hello?" The Denver skyline came into view as the massive aircraft began its descent. Brenda stormed back to the Vance family, all professional composure completely gone. "You think you've won this? But you have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed at Elias. "I have friends. Very powerful friends." Elias finally broke his calm, strategic silence. "Ms. Walsh, for your own sake, I strongly suggest you stop talking immediately." As the plane touched down at Denver International, passengers peered out the windows, startled to see a veritable welcoming committee waiting on the tarmac. It wasn't the usual ground crew. It was a line of people in expensive suits, clearly airline executives, accompanied by a half-dozen uniformed airport security officers. What do you think those powerful friends Brenda mentioned are capable of? This swift action by the airline seems like a win. But is it just damage control? Or the beginning of real accountability? Have you ever witnessed a workplace drama unfold so publicly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe that corporations must be held accountable for the actions of their employees, hit that like button. Brenda maintained her misplaced confidence right up until the jet bridge connected and the aircraft door swung open. A woman in an impeccable business suit with an Azure Wings executive badge stepped aboard. Brenda stepped forward with a victorious smile. "Thank goodness you're here. This passenger," she said, pointing a finger at Elias, "has been harassing me, making false accusations and threatening the crew. I need him removed from this flight immediately." The executive, Camilla Rossi, didn't even glance at Elias. She addressed the pilot. "Captain Miller, I'm Camilla Rossi, Vice President of In-Flight Services. Per corporate directive, I need your entire cabin crew to deplane immediately with all your documentation. A replacement crew is on standby." Brenda's face crumpled in confusion. "Wait, what? We're being deplaned? But what about them?" She pointed an accusing finger at the Vance family. "Ms. Walsh, along with Mr. Dunn and the rest of this first-class cabin crew, are being removed from duty, effective immediately, pending a full investigation, Ms. Rossi announced, her voice clear and loud enough for every passenger in the front cabin to hear. Airport security will escort you to the administrative offices. As two security officers stepped forward, Brenda's professional facade completely disintegrated. This is ridiculous. They're lying. This is all because he's rich and he's black. This is reverse racism. It's reverse racism. Passengers watched in stunned silence as Brenda was escorted off the aircraft, still shrieking her baseless accusations. Kevin and the other crew members followed quietly, their faces ashen with the sudden, catastrophic end of their careers. Through the windows, the passengers could see a fresh, new crew making their way across the tarmac. Ladies and gentlemen, Camilla Rossi addressed the cabin, her voice calm and authoritative. On behalf of Azure Wings Airlines, I extend our most sincere and profound apologies for this unacceptable incident and for the delay in your journey. A new flight crew will be taking over to ensure your safety and comfort for the remainder of the flight to San Francisco. We will be providing details of the compensation you will all be receiving before your arrival. She then approached the Vance family directly, kneeling down to be at eye level with Leo. "Young man," she said softly, "on behalf of every single person at our company, I want to personally apologize for your experience today. What happened to you and your family was inexcusable, and it does not reflect the values we stand for." As the replacement crew boarded, bringing with them fresh meals and premium amenities for every single passenger, Elias Vance watched the proceedings with a measured satisfaction. The immediate response from the airline was appropriate, a textbook case of crisis management. But he knew from long, hard experience that systemic problems rarely, if ever, had such simple solutions. What none of the other relieved passengers could possibly know was that this dramatic incident was far from over. It was merely the end of the beginning. In the terminal, as the plane refueled for its onward journey, Brenda Walsh broke away from her security escort. She sprinted toward the massive terminal windows overlooking the aircraft, her face a grotesque mask of pure rage. She began pounding on the thick glass, pointing a shaking finger directly at Elias and shouting words that the passengers couldn't hear but could easily read on her lips. Vile racial slurs and violent threats that shocked even those who had already witnessed her abhorrent behavior. Airport security quickly swarmed and restrained her, but not before dozens of passengers had captured the unhinged tirade on their phones. As she was finally dragged away, kicking and screaming, her eyes met Elias's through the glass. In that single, chilling moment, Brenda Walsh seemed to finally realize that her 20-year career was gone forever. What she couldn't possibly fathom was that this was merely the first, small domino to fall in a sequence of events that would ultimately expose a web of corruption reaching into the highest echelons of corporate America. The powerful friends she had bragged about were real, and they were about to enter the fray. The new professional flight crew served the Vance family with impeccable courtesy and genuine kindness as the plane finally took off from Denver for San Francisco. Yet Elias's mind was already racing miles ahead, analyzing the incident not as an isolated case of one employee's bigotry, but as a critical data point in a much larger, more troubling pattern. His instincts, the very same instincts that had built his technology empire from the ground up, were screaming that something much more significant was happening just beneath the surface. Brenda's final, desperate threat about her powerful friends hadn't felt like the empty bluff of a terminated employee. It had felt like a warning, one he would soon discover was all too terrifyingly real. As Azure Wings Flight 724 finally touched down at San Francisco International Airport, news crews were already assembled on the tarmac, their cameras aimed at the aircraft. Word of the incident, amplified by videos from passengers during the Denver stopover, had spread like wildfire across social media platforms worldwide. Elias calmly guided his children through the bustling terminal. Leo was still subdued, holding tightly to his father's hand, while Nina walked protectively on her brother's other side, her young face set with a grim determination. Have you ever seen justice delivered so swiftly and decisively? This seems like a clear-cut case, but we're only just beginning to peel back the layers of a much deeper problem. Comment: accountability. If you believe companies should always take immediate action against employees who engage in discriminatory behavior. If you think more organizations need to take a firm stand against racism and abuse, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to see how this powerful story of consequence and corruption unfolds. Mr. Vance, can we get a statement about the racist flight attendant? Reporters shouted as the family approached the exit where their security detail was waiting. Elias paused and raised a hand politely. My children and my family have been through more than enough today. I have no comment at this time, except to say this: actions always have consequences. His dignified, measured response, captured by dozens of cameras, would become the defining soundbite of the rapidly unfolding story. As the Vances slipped into a waiting armored limousine, the scene unfolding at another part of the airport was dramatically different. Brenda Walsh, still in her Azure Wings uniform, but now stripped of her company credentials, stormed through the employee exit after being formally processed for immediate and indefinite suspension. Her face was blotchy and streaked with tears, but her eyes burned with a fiery indignation, not a shred of remorse. "This is a complete witch hunt," she shouted at the human resources representative who had conducted her tense exit interview. 20 years of perfect, unblemished service records, and I get suspended because some rich guy cries racism? The HR representative, a young black woman who had maintained a calm, professional composure throughout Brenda's increasingly hostile and racist tirade, simply replied, "Ms. Walsh, your suspension is based on multiple corroborated passenger accounts and clear video evidence of you physically striking a minor. Race has nothing to do with our company's absolute zero-tolerance policy on the physical assault of a child." Brenda's new lawyer, a slick, silver-haired man named Arthur Croft, with an expensive suit and cold, calculating eyes, placed a restraining hand on his client's arm. "We will be vigorously pursuing claims of wrongful termination, defamation of character, and severe emotional distress," he informed the HR representative in a smooth, menacing tone. "My client was simply doing her job, maintaining order and safety in a very difficult and escalating situation created by an unruly passenger." As they exited the building, Brenda was startled to see the Vance family's limousine pulling away from the adjacent private terminal. In a moment of sheer irrationality, she broke free from her lawyer's grasp and sprinted across the active pickup lanes, narrowly dodging a speeding taxi as she raced toward the departing vehicle. "You think you can ruin me?" she screamed, pounding her fists on the limousine's thick, tinted window as it slowed to make a turn. "You people are all the same. You use your money, and you cry victim to get whatever you want." Inside the vehicle, Leo shrank back against his father as the woman who had struck him continued her unhinged tirade, now spewing a torrent of vile racial slurs that made Nina gasp. Elias calmly pressed a button on his phone console, activating the vehicle's exterior microphones and cameras, capturing every hateful word and crazed gesture of Brenda's public meltdown. Airport security officers quickly converged on the scene, pulling a struggling Brenda away from the vehicle. "Ma'am, you're creating a serious disturbance," one officer said firmly. "Do you know what he did to me?" Brenda shrieked, gesturing wildly at the limousine as it pulled smoothly away into traffic. "He got me fired! Over nothing! All because he's rich and he's black!" The security officers exchanged a weary glance as Brenda continued her venomous rant, now incorporating even more explicit and shocking racial language. Dozens of bystanders had their phones out, recording the entire ugly scene. Arthur Croft finally caught up, a look of utter horror on his face at his client's self-destructive public spectacle. "Brenda, stop talking immediately," he hissed, trying to guide her away from the rapidly growing crowd. But the damage was irreparable. By nightfall, Brenda Walsh's racist airport meltdown would be the #1 trending topic on every social media platform worldwide. The footage had garnered millions of views, with thousands of comments from a global audience condemning her explicitly hateful language. The carefully crafted press statement her lawyer had prepared, which painted her as a victim of a misunderstanding and an overreaction, was rendered completely and utterly ineffective by the raw, unvarnished video of her true attitudes. At the Dallas headquarters of Azure Wings, an emergency board meeting was convened late into the night. The company's CEO, Mark Davies, looked pale and grim as he addressed the assembled executives. "The videos are everywhere," he reported, his voice heavy. "We've already issued a statement confirming the immediate termination of Brenda Walsh, and we're firing the entire crew that stood by and failed to intervene when she assaulted that child." "Isn't that a bit excessive?" asked one nervous board member. "The other crew members didn't actually do anything." "That's precisely the problem," Davies responded, his voice steely. "They witnessed a child being racially abused, taunted, and then physically assaulted by their colleague, and they did nothing. That is not who we are as a company." What Davies didn't share with the rest of the board was the content of his earlier, terse phone call with Elias Vance. Vance's investment firm controlled enough Azure Wings stock to either save the airline or send it into a death spiral. Vance hadn't made a single threat or demand. Instead, he had simply asked one ice-cold question. Does Azure Wings Airlines now consider child abuse and overt racism to be a part of its official brand identity? By morning, Azure Wings had released a new, much stronger statement confirming the termination of not just Brenda Walsh, but the entire first-class cabin crew of Flight 724. The company announced a comprehensive, top-to-bottom review of its anti-discrimination and de-escalation training protocols and pledged absolute zero tolerance for any form of discriminatory behavior. The statement made headlines across every major news outlet, with most commentators praising the company's swift and decisive response. What none of them knew was that Elias Vance had already instructed his team to begin a quiet, systematic review of every single contract his vast business empire, a portfolio worth over $200 million annually in corporate travel alone, had with Azure Wings and its various parent and subsidiary companies. As the Vance family arrived at their magnificent estate in Bel Air, Elias's phone rang with an update from his chief of staff. "Sir, the contracts with Azure are being reviewed. We'll begin reevaluating our entire travel portfolio as planned," his chief of staff reported. "But there's something else you should know. We're seeing a highly organized social media campaign that's starting to form around Brenda Walsh. It doesn't look organic. The messaging is too coordinated." Elias thanked him and hung up, gazing thoughtfully at his children, who were finally beginning to relax in the safety of their home theater, the day's traumatic events momentarily forgotten as they lost themselves in the vibrant world of an animated film. He had hoped this would be a simple, albeit ugly, case of accountability for one person's reprehensible actions, but his finely honed instincts were telling him it was about to become something much more complex, and far, far more dangerous. What do you think is going to happen next? Will Brenda Walsh accept her termination and fade away? Or is this just the opening shot in a much bigger battle? And who could possibly be behind a coordinated social media campaign supporting someone who was caught on video assaulting a child and screaming racial slurs? The real conspiracy is just beginning to unfold. By the following morning, the hashtag #AzureWingsRacism had become the top trending topic across all global social media platforms. The various video clips, Brenda Walsh slapping Leo Vance, her racist tirade in the cabin, and her unhinged meltdown at the airport, had been viewed over 50 million times. Public opinion seemed overwhelmingly, almost universally, against the former flight attendant, with the vast majority of commenters expressing shock and disgust that such blatant racism and violence could occur in the year 2025. But by mid-afternoon, a sophisticated and well-funded counter-narrative began to emerge. A professionally coiffed and conservatively dressed Brenda Walsh appeared on a popular national morning news program, tears streaming down her face as she told a dramatically different and entirely fabricated version of events. "I have devoted my entire life to customer service and safety," she sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue provided by the host. What the edited videos they are showing you don't reveal is how dangerously disruptive that child was being throughout the flight. He was running in the aisles during turbulence, throwing food, endangering the other passengers. The interviewer, a man known for his sympathetic approach to controversial figures, nodded encouragingly. "And you're saying that the child's father, the billionaire Elias Vance, then used his immense wealth and power to have you summarily fired without any due process?" "Exactly." Brenda nodded vigorously, her performance masterful. 20 years of perfect, glowing service records thrown away because a powerful man played the race card. What about my rights? What about the fact that I'm a single mother with 2 kids and a mortgage to pay? No mention was made of the multiple unedited videos that clearly showed Leo Vance seated quietly when Brenda struck him. No mention was made of her vile, racist tirade at the airport. Instead, the television segment featured carefully selected, heartwarming photos of Brenda volunteering at a local animal shelter and a glowing, pre-recorded testimonial from a former colleague who praised her unflappable professionalism. Within hours of the interview airing, a new hashtag began to trend. #StandWithBrenda. The entire online conversation shifted dramatically. Thousands of newly created social media accounts began sharing near-identical messages about the dangers of reverse racism, woke mobs, and cancel culture gone too far. An online fundraiser set up for Brenda's legal defense miraculously collected over $100,000 in its first day at the Dallas headquarters of Azure Wings. CEO Mark Davies stared grimly at the social media analytics displayed on the massive screen in his office. "This is a coordinated professional campaign," he told his crisis management team. "These are not organic reactions. This is an organized attack." His private line rang with a number he recognized immediately. It was Elias Vance. "I assume you're seeing what I'm seeing," Elias said without preamble when Davies answered. "Yes. And just so you know, Elias, we're not backing down from our decision. The videos speak for themselves." "It's bigger than your airline now, Mark," Elias replied, his voice calm but firm. "My security team has already identified bot networks and sock puppet accounts amplifying her message. Someone with very significant resources is backing her." As Elias spoke, his personal assistant discreetly alerted him to a breaking news story. Vance Innovations had just lost a $50 million government contract for cloud services that had been all but finalized the previous week. The official reason cited was a sudden administrative reconsideration, but the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Meanwhile, at the exclusive Crestview Preparatory School in San Francisco, Leo Vance had returned to his third-grade class. Elias had personally notified the school's administration about the flight incident, expecting them to provide additional support for his clearly traumatized son. Instead, the headmaster, Dr. Albright, seemed strangely distant and non-committal during their phone call, offering only the most perfunctory expressions of concern. Elias now understood why. His phone buzzed with a text from Nina, who was in her 7th grade classroom across campus. It read, "Dad, you need to come to the school. Right now. The parents are saying horrible things to Leo." Elias arrived at Crestview Prep to find his son sitting alone in the headmaster's office, tears streaming silently down his small face. Dr. Albright looked deeply uncomfortable, but not particularly sympathetic. "Mr. Vance," he began, "there seems to be some disagreement among our parent community regarding the incident on your flight." "Disagreement?" Elias echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. "My 8-year-old son was physically assaulted by an airline employee. There is clear, undeniable video evidence." Dr. Albright shifted in his expensive leather chair. "Several of our most prominent families who are major benefactors to this institution, believe the media coverage has been unfair to Ms. Walsh. They feel your family's influence and wealth have distorted the true story." "They're calling Leo a liar," Nina interjected, having just entered the office, her eyes flashing with fury. "They're saying that Dad only got to where he is by playing the race card, and that Leo probably deserved it." "Young lady, that's not precisely what—" Dr. Albright began, his tone condescending. "It's exactly what Clarissa Sterling's mother said," Nina countered, her voice rising. "Right in the middle of the hallway, loud enough for everyone to hear." Elias's calm exterior masked the chilling realization that what he was facing extended far beyond one flight attendant's bigotry. The coordinated nature of the online backlash, the sudden and suspicious government contract cancellation, and now the school administration's thinly veiled hostility, it all pointed to something far more organized and systematic. "Dr. Albright," Elias said quietly, "are you suggesting that my children are no longer welcome at Crestview Preparatory School?" The headmaster's pained expression confirmed Elias's suspicion before he even spoke. "Mr. Vance, perhaps it would be for the best, for everyone, if Leo and Nina took some time away from campus until this unfortunate media attention dies down." In other words, Elias thought, protect the wealthy white families from the uncomfortable reality of racism, rather than protect the black children who are actually being victimized by it. It was a depressingly familiar pattern, just playing out in a new, more expensive setting. As the Vances left the school, where reporters had somehow already gathered at the main gates, Elias ushered his children into their waiting car as a barrage of shouted questions followed them. "Mr. Vance, how do you respond to the allegations that you fabricated the assault claims? Is it true you threatened to buy Azure Wings Airlines and fire everyone if Ms. Walsh wasn't immediately terminated? Did you offer Crestview Prep a massive donation to cover up your son's behavioral issues?" The questions were so specific, so precisely targeted, so perfectly aligned with Brenda Walsh's false narrative, that Elias knew with absolute certainty they could not be a coincidence. Someone was orchestrating a comprehensive, multi-pronged campaign to discredit him and, by extension, to delegitimize any and all claims of racial discrimination. Back at his corporate headquarters, Elias's deepest suspicions were confirmed. His chief security officer, a formidable ex-Mossad agent named Zara, showed him a disturbing pattern of online activity. "These aren't just random supporters, Mr. Vance," she explained, pointing to a complex network diagram on her screen. "Brenda Walsh's social media campaign and her legal fund are being amplified and funded by accounts directly linked to 3 major corporations that compete directly with your companies. One name in particular keeps showing up. Arthur Croft's law firm, Croft & Associates, which is representing Brenda Walsh, is simultaneously representing all 3 of those corporations in various legal matters." The coincidence seemed too perfect to be random. "There's more," Zara continued. "Arthur Croft has deep, though deliberately obscured, connections to several extremist groups that have been classified as domestic hate organizations. He's spoken at their private events and represented their leaders pro bono in so-called free speech cases." The pieces were beginning to lock together, forming a picture far more sinister and disturbing than a simple case of one flight attendant's racial bias. Just then, Elias's phone buzzed with a news alert. Kevin Dunn, the lead flight attendant from the Azure Wings flight, had just released a public statement through Croft's law firm. In it, he claimed that the video of Brenda slapping Leo had been deceptively edited, and that it was actually Elias Vance who had been the real aggressor during the incident. The claim was patently absurd on its face. The unedited, multi-angle videos from other passengers clearly showed the entire, unvarnished interaction. But Elias knew from bitter experience that in the face of a well-funded, coordinated disinformation campaign, the truth alone wasn't always enough to win. As he contemplated his next moves, Elias received another alert. 3 more major contracts with his companies, totaling nearly $100 million, had been mysteriously delayed or canceled by his corporate partners. The message was becoming brutally clear. This wasn't just about defending Brenda Walsh anymore. It was about making a public example of Elias Vance. It was about showing the world that even a black trillionaire could not, and would not, be allowed to challenge certain established power structures without facing devastating consequences. What these unseen forces didn't understand, however, was that Elias Vance hadn't built his empire by backing down from challenges. He had succeeded in business, not despite the obstacles placed in his way because of his race, but because those obstacles had forced him to become more strategic, more thorough, and infinitely more resilient than any of his competitors. If someone wanted to use this incident to teach a lesson, they had chosen the wrong student. Elias Vance calmly opened his laptop and began composing an email to his executive war room. The subject line was simple and direct. Comprehensive response strategy. The real battle was just beginning. The mahogany-paneled conference room of Croft & Associates exuded generations of old money and deeply entrenched power. Brenda Walsh sat nervously at the end of the massive, polished table, looking distinctly out of place despite her new designer outfit, which had been purchased with a small portion of the proceeds from her rapidly growing legal defense fund. Arthur Croft, her attorney, adjusted his solid gold cufflinks as he addressed his assembled team of lawyers and public relations specialists. "The wrongful termination suit against Azure Wings is just the opening salvo," he announced, his voice smooth and confident. "We are positioning Ms. Walsh as the tragic victim of woke culture and cancel society, a hard-working, patriotic American woman who was sacrificed on the altar of political correctness to appease a powerful black man throwing his weight around. Brenda nodded along, becoming increasingly comfortable and adept at playing this role, which completely absolved her of any personal responsibility. "They didn't even give me a chance to tell my side of the story," she added, perfectly reciting the talking point she'd been coached on all morning. What she didn't notice was the meaningful, subtle glance exchanged between Arthur Croft and Clarissa Sterling, a sharply dressed woman whose powerful family name adorned university buildings and hospital wings throughout the country. The Sterlings were not just prominent figures in society, they were the majority shareholders in Apex Dynamics, Elias Vance's chief corporate rival. "Our internal polling shows significant traction with the reverse racism angle," reported the lead PR director. "We already have 3 U.S. senators prepared to make public statements about the dangerous precedent of allowing wealthy, powerful individuals to destroy the livelihoods of working-class Americans over mere perceived slights." The lawsuit Brenda had filed that morning made headlines on every major network. The official complaint painted her as a dedicated, compassionate professional who had gently tried to redirect an unruly, aggressive child, only to have her stellar 20-year career destroyed by a vindictive, racially motivated overreaction. The suit demanded $40 million in damages for wrongful termination, defamation of character, and emotional distress. The dollar amount was deliberately provocative, strategically designed to generate maximum public outrage. It worked perfectly. By lunchtime, conservative media commentators were devoting entire segments to the case, framing it as the perfect emblem of everything wrong with modern America. "This is what happens when we elevate people based on identity politics instead of merit," declared one popular pundit to his millions of viewers. "A man becomes a trillionaire through diversity initiatives and sweetheart government contracts, and then he uses that unearned power to crush a working-class single mother for simply doing her job." The narrative was as demonstrably false as it was brutally effective. Elias Vance had built his fortune through revolutionary technological innovations and shrewd business acumen, entirely without government assistance or diversity programs. But the highly coordinated and well-funded messaging campaign was successfully creating an alternative reality, a false narrative that millions of viewers were beginning to accept as the gospel truth. Elias watched these developments with a cool, analytical detachment from the war room he had established in his home office, where he had gathered a formidable response team of his own. "They're not just defending Brenda Walsh," he observed to his team. "They're using this isolated incident to attack the very concept of anti-racism itself." His general counsel nodded grimly. 6 more corporate contracts have been canceled this morning, all with companies that have deep financial ties to the Sterling family or their known associates. "This is a coordinated economic assault. And the situation at the school has escalated," added Elias's chief of staff. Crestview Academy's board has just voted to formally suspend Leo and Nina, pending a full investigation into their on-campus behavior. 3 other prominent families have now withdrawn their children, citing that they no longer feel safe with your children at the school. Elias absorbed this flood of alarming information with the same calm, unnerving precision that had guided his ascent from abject poverty to unprecedented wealth. Where others might have seen only a series of devastating attacks, he recognized a clear pattern that was revealing his opponent's strategy, and more importantly, their hidden vulnerabilities. "They're attempting to isolate us, both socially and economically," he concluded, his voice even. "These are classic tactics used against anyone who dares to challenge deeply entrenched power. But they have made 3 critical and ultimately fatal errors." He stood and approached the large digital whiteboard where his team had been meticulously mapping the intricate connections between Brenda Walsh, Arthur Croft, the Sterling family, and the various media outlets and political figures who were amplifying their false narrative. "First," he said, tapping the screen, "they assumed I would respond to their attacks emotionally rather than strategically. Second, they have dangerously underestimated how much evidence we have already quietly gathered. And third," a slight, confident smile touched his lips, "they forgot to check what other companies I own." Elias gestured to his chief technology officer. "Activate Protocol Veritas." The CTO nodded and began typing rapidly on his laptop. Within minutes, every major social media platform lit up. Authenticated, time-stamped video from multiple different angles capturing the entire flight incident was simultaneously released. This included crystal-clear footage that hadn't previously been made public. The videos came with a forensic certification of their authenticity from 3 different independent labs, leaving absolutely no room for any further claims of deceptive editing. Simultaneously, a small independent media company that Elias secretly owned released a bombshell investigative report. It meticulously documented Brenda Walsh's long history of customer complaints at Azure Wings, which were found to be disproportionately filed by passengers of color. Several former Azure Wings employees, their identities protected by anonymity, described a clear and repeated pattern of similar biased behavior from Brenda that had been repeatedly overlooked and often actively buried by a specific manager in the HR department. But Elias's most brilliant and effective countermove targeted the financial infrastructure that was propping up Brenda's entire campaign. His financial intelligence team had traced the primary funding sources for her suddenly enormous legal defense fund back to a series of opaque shell companies. These companies were, in turn, ultimately controlled by the Sterling family and their close business associates. "Release the financial analysis," Elias instructed his communications director. Within hours, detailed, easy-to-understand reports appeared across dozens of reputable financial news outlets, with headlines like, "Flight Attendants' Grassroots Support Revealed as AstroTurf Campaign Funded by Tech Rivals Family." The articles meticulously documented how the very same corporate entities that were bankrolling Brenda Walsh's defense were also the ones systematically canceling contracts with Vance Innovations and its subsidiary companies. The coordinated nature of these stunning revelations shifted the public narrative dramatically and irrevocably. What had been cleverly portrayed as a simple employment dispute was now being exposed as a sophisticated, cynical attempt by powerful, entrenched interests to weaponize racism for corporate gain. Brenda Walsh, watching her smartphone notifications explode with this new wave of devastating coverage, turned pale. "They're saying I'm just a pawn," she stammered to Arthur Croft during an emergency phone call. "They're saying I'm being used by billionaires in some kind of corporate war." Croft's usually composed, arrogant demeanor showed clear cracks of concern. "Stay on message, Brenda," he instructed firmly. "You are the victim here. Remember that. Vance is just trying to distract from his own abuse of power." But the damage control was already failing. The next morning, an anonymous source leaked a series of emails between Arthur Croft and Clarissa Sterling. In them, they discussed the urgent need to make an example of Vance and to put him back in his place after he had clearly forgotten who really runs things in this country. The racial undertones were unmistakable and sickening. The public and political backlash was swift and brutal. The 3 senators who had so publicly supported Brenda quickly and clumsily tried to distance themselves from the case. Her online fundraising completely flatlined as donors began to question whether their contributions were actually supporting a wronged working-class woman or just funding a corporate proxy war. Elias's brilliant, multi-pronged strategic response had successfully exposed the broader, uglier agenda lurking behind Brenda's lawsuit. But he knew his opponents were powerful, deeply entrenched, and unaccustomed to losing. Their counterattack came from a direction he had not anticipated, and it was far more personal and cruel. Leo, still deeply traumatized by the original assault and his subsequent shunning at school, had been seeing a highly recommended child therapist to help him process his experiences. After a particularly difficult session, Elias found his son in tears, clutching his tablet. "What's wrong, buddy?" Elias asked gently. "The kids at school," Leo sobbed, his small body shaking. "They're sending me messages. They're saying I lied about everything, that I hit the lady first and she was just defending herself." Elias took the tablet and found dozens of vicious, cruel messages that had been sent to Leo from his classmates, all of them clearly parroting the hateful, false language they were hearing from their parents. The coordinated bullying campaign had moved beyond attacking the adults and was now directly targeting an 8-year-old child who was already suffering from severe trauma. For the first time since the incident began, Elias Vance felt his carefully maintained composure crack. He had faced down discrimination and bigotry his entire life, developing sophisticated strategies to overcome barriers and succeed despite them. But seeing his own children suffer so profoundly for the simple fact of existing in their own skin awakened something deep and primal in him that went far beyond his strategic business mind. As he held his sobbing son, Elias's secure phone rang with news that would transform the conflict yet again. It was Zara, his chief security officer. Her voice was urgent. "Sir, we've traced the source of the hateful emails attacking Leo. They aren't just from his classmates' homes. The bulk of them are coming from inside Crestview Academy's administration building." The chilling realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about Brenda Walsh, or even about a corporate rivalry anymore. The Sterlings and their allies were willing to actively participate in the psychological torture of a child just to maintain their precarious position at the very top of America's social and economic hierarchy. For people like them, a black trillionaire wasn't a sign of progress. He was a dangerous anomaly that threatened the very system they had built and benefited from for generations. Elias Vance had always operated within that system, finding clever ways to succeed despite its inherent biases. Now, in this moment of profound pain and clarity, he realized the system itself needed to be exposed, dismantled, and rebuilt. With a newfound ironclad determination, he initiated the next phase of his response, a comprehensive, no-holds-barred investigation into just how deep and how wide this network of corruption and racial animus truly extended. What he was about to uncover would shock even him, a man who thought he had seen and understood the true face of American power.